Good morning and welcome. For those of you who are sitting up in those seats, I'm so sorry, you're just a very faint blur to me, but I know you're there and I hope you get a chance to fully participate in the discussion. If you are looking for seats down, you can tell I'm an old sort of school captain type. There are seats down the front, so if you'd really like to get closer to the action, please don't hesitate to come down the front. Can I begin this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. One of the instructions that we were given is that we really need to try and channel Tony Jones. I think it's safe to say I'm so far removed from Tony Jones. I don't have his beautiful dulcet tones, let alone his wonderful ways of asking questions. But one of the things that I'm delighted about this morning is this isn't going to be your traditional presentation and question and answer session. Really the whole purpose of the entire conference, and we're really going to try to tease this out in a number of the sessions, is how do we actually, following fantastic presentations, facilitate a discussion and really put into practice that wonderful issue about knowledge translation and exchange. So I've got the pleasure this morning of introducing two fantastic speakers. I might focus firstly on Dr. Peta Cox. So Peta is the Senior Research Officer at ANROWS. She was the Principal and, as Heather reminded me this morning, the sole investigator on two of the ANROWS projects, including the additional analysis of the ABS Personal Safety Survey and also the review of the literature on the co-occurrence of domestic violence and sexual assault. Prior to being at ANROWS, Peta worked in knowledge translation for the New South Wales Ambulance Service and the New South Wales Ombudsman. She has a PhD in public health and community medicine from the University of New South Wales. Now, Peta's presentation, some of you will have heard about this before. It's something very near and dear to a number of our hearts about the prevalence and incidence of violence against women in various subpopulations. And one of the things Peta's also going to tease out is even that reference to subpopulations. So I'd love to welcome to the stage Dr. Peta Cox.
Good morning and welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to pay my respects to their elders both past and present. This morning's presentation is an examination of the additional analysis of the PSS that I completed last year. Before I begin, however, or before I go into more detail on that, I want to begin by acknowledging a conversation I had yesterday around the term subpopulations. So the term subpopulations may be of concern to some people, and I want to be really clear about what we mean when we refer to it. The PSS is a data set that collects information about people, all people in Australia. It's not even just limited to Australian citizens. That's the population that it's concerned with. This is, what the data aims to represent. There's some limitations in that. There's some groups that aren't represented as well as we might hope, but that's the aim of the data, is to look at that group. Whenever we talk about a part of that group, that's generally referred to within the statistical kind of lexicon as a subpopulation. So it's typically used to refer to demographic characteristics or to identity. So things such as age, income, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, disability status. And so in some ways it's often used to refer to groups that we have a particular interest in ensuring that our policies are responsive to. It's a statistical term and it does not in any way reflect a lack of value, significance or importance to those groups. All it is indicating is that those groups are a part of a larger whole within the statistical realm in which we're working. So this presentation is only going to very briefly look at information about subpopulations, primarily because of some of the limitations in the PSS for engaging with demographic information. What we'll primarily focus on is the nature of the PSS, what it is, some high-level prevalence statistics, and then a more detailed case study about sexual assault data. So using sexual assault data both as valuable and important data in and of itself, but also as a way of demonstrating some of the breadth of the data that's available within the PSS. So the PSS is run by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's run about every 4 years, and it's an aspect of the National Plan to Prevent Violence Against Women. It's Australia's best quantitative data on interpersonal violence. It has about 17,000 participants, which is a very large survey population, and they come from all states and territories. The data is weighted then, so we've got the 17,000 people who answer the survey and then is modelled by the ABS to represent Australia population as a whole. It provides extremely detailed information, particularly around most recent incident of violence. It's also a household survey, and this is relatively uncommon these days. It's a survey where someone comes and they knock on your door and they say, I'd like to come and talk to you about this particular issue. This is done as a way of protecting people, so ensuring that they're answering questions in a safe environment. It also has some key limitations. So because this is this household survey, it means that there are limitations on who gets included. The particular limitations that we need to be aware of is some limitations around people with a disability who may be in institutionalised care settings and therefore not eligible to participate, as well as people for whom English is not a language which they are able to complete a survey. So in particular, women and men from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. In addition to those really common and legitimate criticisms of the PSS, there's also a range of criticisms that come up, mainly because the data hasn't often been out in the public domain. So I've had experiences since publishing the report of people saying to me, I really wish there was information about alcohol and other drugs. I really wish there was information about why women separate from their partners. That information is available in the survey, but it hasn't historically been out in the public domain. And that's one of the reasons that ANROWS did this work, was to try to ensure that some of that more detailed and rich information was actually available. The PSS is a really important survey. It is our most reliable population-level estimates of violence, and that means that it's used in most how big the problem is kind of conversations. So that beginning bit of a briefing document or a news piece, most often that information is coming from the PSS, or the PSS is the most reliable stuff you could use for that. It's also a set of numbers that are the basis of other numbers that we use in our work and we rely on. So without the PSS, we don't have burden of disease estimates. Without the PSS, we don't have economic impact calculations. We need those estimates in order to do that other work. Finally, the PSS is the basis of some men's rights claims. And so in order to respond to those meaningfully, we need to understand what it is that the data tells us. So let's get into some data. The PSS shows us that more men than women have experienced violence in their lifetime, since the age of 15. When we say violence in the context of the PSS, we mean sexual assault, sexual threat, physical assault, or physical threat. And I've just realised I've forgotten something 2 steps ago. I'm going to go back to that and just explain it to you. So the big wheel here is actually explaining to you some of the data that's included. So the PSS includes for us information about stalking, about partner violence, about emotional abuse when it's perpetrated by a partner, demographic details, but also information about 8 types of violence, and this is why I think it's important for us to mention. So those 8 types of violence are physical assault, physical threat, sexual assault, and sexual threat by a male or female partner. So 4 times 2 gives us 8. Most of the information on those 8 types of violence is using the most recent incident information. So when we're talking about violence in this context, we're talking about physical assault, physical threat, sexual assault, or sexual threat. So, going back to our high-level prevalence, more men than more men than women experience violence since the age of 15, but the nature of that violence is very different. So for the 4.1 million men in Australia who have experienced at least one incident of violence since the age of 15, they're most likely to have experienced violence by a stranger in a place of entertainment. So a place of entertainment is somewhere like a bar, a club, the theatre, a football field, somewhere where you go and have fun. In contrast, the 3.6 million women who've experienced at least one incident of violence since the age of 15 are most likely to experience violence by a partner in their home. Very different scenarios of violence. But for both men and women, they are 3 times more likely to experience violence by a man than by a woman. If we're looking at women's experience of partner violence, and I use the word partner violence very carefully, so to give a little bit of background on that, and that's hopefully one of our more final definitional discussions, the PSS at this high-level prevalence information is simply asking whether you've experienced at least one incident of violence, so one or more incident of violence by a partner. It doesn't indicate that you're having the overall kind of dynamics that we associate with domestic violence. Although a large number of women who will have experienced at least one incident of violence will have those dynamics, not everyone will. Not everyone will have had coercive control, power over repeated instances of violence, anxiety and fear. The PSS asks questions about those aspects in the detailed information, but this prevalence information is not about that. This prevalence is only saying that women have experienced at least one incident of violence since the age of 15. So, moving on now into that information, what's been in the public domain historically is that 1 in 6 women have experienced violence by a partner they were living with, a cohabiting partner. What has also been available from the ABS is that 1 in 9 women, or about 990,000 women, have experienced violence by a boyfriend, girlfriend or date, or what can also be called a non-cohabiting partner. ANROWS then combined those groups, and there's obviously a range of people who fit in the middle there, who experience violence by both a cohabiting partner and a non-cohabiting partner in their lifetime. And so, there needed to be a bit of calculation done. It's not a simple adding of numbers together. But what we found was that 25.1%, 1 in 4 women in Australia, or close to 2.2 million women, had experienced at least one incident of violence by an intimate partner, when that includes a partner they may or may not have been living with. I'm now going to focus on some information around sexual assault. So the PSS shows that 1.7 million women in Australia have experienced at least one incident of sexual violence. So that's either sexual assault or sexual threat. The vast majority of those, 1.5 million, have experienced sexual assault. In part, I think an explanation of that is that sexual threat in the definitions used in the PSS is about a threat that is face-to-face and where you can reasonably expect that the threat would be carried out. It doesn't include some of the more generalised experiences of harassment that women might have experienced. It is very much an immediate threat to the self. So our 1.5 million women represents about 1 in 5 women in Australia, and over 99% of those assaults were perpetrated by a male. If we look more recently, we find that in the year prior to the survey, 87,800 women were sexually assaulted. This represents 1% of women in Australia, or 18.8% of women who had experienced violence in that time. In comparison to that 1% across the entirety of Australia, if we're looking at women who are aged 18 to 24 years, their estimated prevalence is 2.2% and represents 23,500 women. This is about 1 in 4 sexual assaults in that period, and so it's about double the rate that you're seeing within other age groups. In addition, what we find is that more women experience sexual assault by a partner they weren't living with than a partner that they were. So of the 805,900 women who were sexually assaulted by a male intimate partner, that broad group that includes both cohabiting and non-cohabiting, about 469,900 experienced violence by boyfriend or date, 44,200 by a current partner, so a partner that on the day of the survey they were in a relationship with, and 354,100 by a partner who they were no longer with at the time of the survey. I'm now going to go on to some of the information that's available about the characteristics of incidents of sexual assault. This information is based on that most recent incident data that we were talking briefly about earlier. It gives us a partial picture. So there are a range of women who have experienced sexual assault multiple times, and for them, they're only going to be talking about and giving detail about their most recent incident. So we're not able to say using this data that X percentage of women experience miscarriage as a result of sexual assault. This data doesn't give us that. All it gives us is that 3.1% of women reported miscarriage after their most recent sexual assault by a male. So it's much more narrow, but what it does give us is some depth. So whenever we're talking about most recent incident data, we're always talking about the same incident across the different bits and the different characteristics of those incidents. So if we look at information available regarding injury, we find that 1 in 3 women reported being physically injured in their most recent sexual assault by a male. Most of those injuries were scratches, bruises or cuts, so about 88.4% of women reported those. 11.1% of women reported having fractures or broken bones. Of course, a woman could report both types of injury. In addition, about 2.6% or 7,300 reported that in their most recent incident, they were stabbed, shot, or had another deep wound, and 3.1% or 8,800 reported that they miscarried as a result of the assault. If we examine data regarding the use of alcohol or other drugs, this information comes from the woman's experience. So she's assessing both her use and that of the perpetrator of the assault. And the kind of line in the sand that gets used here is about whether drug or alcohol use contributed to the incident. So 55.7% of women said that alcohol or other drug use contributed to the incident. Of that 55%, 1 in 3 said that their own alcohol or drug use they considered contributed to the incident. And 9 in 10 said that the perpetrator's use contributed to the incident. The PSS also provides quite a lot of detail about help-seeking behaviours, and I think that this is particularly valuable for people who are engaged with their own service provision, potentially. So the PSS shows us that 15.7% of women didn't tell anyone about their most recent sexual assault by a male. This varies a bit depending on who it is that perpetrated the assault. So it goes up to 18.7% of women who didn't tell anyone when that sexual assault was perpetrated by a cohabiting partner, so a partner they were living with. And then it goes down to 8%, so 8% didn't tell anyone, for women who were sexually assaulted by a stranger. Most women first told what we would roughly call informal supports. So they told a friend, family member, work colleague, etc. This is about 3 out of 4 of the women who did tell someone. 8.3% or 59,800 women who did, of the group who did tell someone first told a GP, with 183,800 seeking support and advice from that source. About 1 in 3 women consider their most recent sexual assault to have been a crime. This number varies a bit, again, by perpetrator. So it's pretty much at 1 in 3 for a known person, including a cohabiting partner, and it goes up to 2/3, so about 60% if the assault was perpetrated by a stranger. The exact number, kind of when you add all the different perpetrators together, is 35.8% who said it was a crime. In addition, 43% said it was wrong but was not a crime, and 18% said it was something that just happens. So this, I don't think I've got something that enables me to point to things. But the top bar that you can see up here, the perceived as a crime, is just what we were talking about there, that 35.8%. This is a discussion, this is a slide and a graph about engagement with the justice service. So of women who had experienced a sexual assault, 35.8% considered it a crime, 19.1% then contacted police. There were a small number of women who didn't perceive it as a crime but did contact police. We suspect that that might be around women who were wanting to inform about an ongoing domestic violence situation. But the data doesn't actually tell us exactly how it is that you end up with that situation. We have 6.9% who said that the perpetrator was charged. This is by the victim who is reporting this, so in some cases, a minority of cases, the victim may not have actually been aware of the charge that was brought forward. And 5.7% then went to court, said the perpetrator went to court. There's quite a bit of differentiation at that 5.7 by perpetrator type. So if you imagine that the 6.9% is kind of 100%, of cases where the perpetrator was charged, 72.4% went on to court if the perpetrator was a cohabiting partner. That got raised to 82.8% if it was a known person that wasn't a cohabiting partner, and then it went up again to 99.9% if the perpetrator was a stranger. So there's almost no loss from when the perpetrator was charged to when the perpetrator went to court if we're dealing with a stranger perpetrated sexual assault. So we find that 1 in 6 women who are in employment took time off work in the year after their most recent sexual assault by a male. This goes up to 22.5%, or 1 in 4, if the assault was by a stranger. Is at about 1 in 5, or 19.8%, if it was by a cohabiting partner, and then drops down to 14% if it was by a known person who wasn't a cohabiting partner. In addition, 3/4 of women reported fear and anxiety after a sexual assault when it was by a cohabiting partner. However, those who were sexually assaulted by a person that they knew but they weren't in a relationship with reported fear and anxiety in about 52.6% of cases. So you recall that we had a brief discussion about subpopulations and the use of that term. So to remind you of that, in this context, all that is indicating is that we're not dealing with the entire population of Australia. We're dealing with a particular group, and that tends to be around demographic features when it's used as a statistical term. So the PSS is a survey that asks right at the beginning of the survey what someone's demographic characteristics are. It's about who you are at the time that you fill out the survey. That has some challenges because people's demographic characteristics change. Not all characteristics, but most of them do. So someone's age changes, they get older, they get a job, they lose a job, they earn more money, they earn less money. They get sick for a while, they recover. And so the demographic characteristics are very much located within a particular time. It means that we're not able to use data that is from since the age of 15 and meaningfully link it to the demographic characteristics because you don't know someone's characteristics at the time of the violence. What we are able to do, and it's a bit of a proxy, is to say that that we use the 12-month prevalence data. So we say that if your demographic characteristics are like this when you fill out the survey, they probably haven't shifted too much between when you fill out the survey and when the violence occurred, if there's less than 12 months between those two. That has implications at a statistical level around what comes up as a statistically significant difference. So because you're dealing with a much smaller population, you actually need to have much bigger differences to be confident that it's not something around who it is that you happen to be talking about. This means that at that statistical level, most of the difference that we see for particular demographic groups is actually not statistically significant. So for sexual assault, the only demographic features that come up as statistically significant are higher rates of sexual assault for women aged 18 to 24 and lower rates for women aged over 55 years. So of all those groups down the bottom that are listed, none of those are coming up as statistically significant. That doesn't mean that differences don't exist. All it means is that they're not coming up because of some of the, limitations. In addition, it's important to acknowledge that at this point the PSS doesn't collect information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status. The reason for this is around concerns about the accuracy of that information. So the PSS is a survey that is primarily done in urban areas, and there is concern that that means that the survey is not going to be representative and will give information that gives a false sense of the experiences of violence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and men. It is certainly a significant concern that we don't have that information that's readily comparable to other groups. However, the ABS tries to use the NAIATSIS, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey, as a way of giving some admittedly less detailed information, but information that they are confident about the accuracy and representativeness of for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the data that has been on display here has been about sexual assault. Similar data, as well as some more detailed information about separation and impacts on children in particular, is also available for partner violence. The ANROWS report aims to support the use of the data by providing infographics, of which you've seen quite a few today, graphs and explanations of statistical concepts. It's been a lot of fun working on the PSS, and I've been really pleased to see how it's already been picked up by media, by advocates, by researchers, and policymakers, and I'm really excited to see how it might be picked up in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. So a fantastic presentation, and if I had to sort of take away a couple of things that I guess really I was reminded about is that Peter talked to us about some of the key statistics for both sexual assault and partner violence. She reminded us about the sheer number of women who are affected by these forms of violence. She also reminded us about some of the incident characteristics, and also talked to us about some of those statistics that are related to the demographic characteristics. So we're now going to move into the next part of the session, and where we're really trying to now tease out, so what does this mean? And what are the implications for policy, for practice? How can this data be used in terms of contextualising policy and practice decisions? And also, what are the ways that we might use this data to better respond to what some might suggest are either inaccurate or misleading portrayals of violence against women? So I'd like to open it up and first of all ask the question, I don't know if it's a small table conversation to begin with for half a minute or so, but to just get people to reflect upon what areas of policy and practice can actually be better informed by this data.
Dr. Cox, I've got a query about children under the age of 15. Do you have the numbers of prevalence of physical and sexual abuse against children under the age of 15 that were reported within that each year? And also some of the demographics, for example, whether they were male or female, what the occupation of their family was, and what their socio-economic status is. Do you have that information on children, please?
Okay, so I guess there's two different, sorry, that's not seeming to come through. There are two aspects, I guess, to that. There's what is currently available in the analysis that I've completed, and there's also then what's available or could theoretically be done with what's in the PSS dataset in and of itself. So as far as most of the questions that you are asking, you could get something through the PSS itself. You could certainly get information around children who had witnessed violence is a question that that is asked and is available, you could probably, although whether the RSEs would get too high might be an issue, you wouldn't be able to do occupation of parents. Occupation isn't something that's collected in any way in the PSS, but you would be able to do SES status, if that's a value. You would be able to do whether they were employed or not. So that would be theoretically possible. The PSS asks women about their own experiences of abuse as a child. And so that information would also be available to you. It, of course, doesn't ask children about their personal experiences. So as far as information about women and men, our analysis was primarily focused on women because the remit of ANROWS is around women's safety, but you would be able to also request that information for men. What I have done here very quickly, flicking through the report, is that more women reported that they had experienced childhood sexual abuse, so 1.1 million women reported that, than childhood physical abuse, which is at 938,000. So that's in the multiple victimisation section. There's then a description about the number of women who'd experienced more than one incident as a child, as well as who the perpetrator of their first incident was. And there's great variation in that, depending on whether the assault was physical or sexual.
So after all of the conversations at tables, did people got questions or have pondering the thing about how this data can be used to better inform policy and practice in the first instance? Everyone's quiet. Oh, I can see a hand up the back. Yep.
We were quite startled by the data showing that so many women don't think sexual assault or violence against them is a crime, and we were kind of thinking that's a really important thing to tackle in policy and practice, and certainly would love to unpick those attitudes and to see what's influencing those.
So one of the questions that I certainly, it certainly asks you to think about is it about our justice responses? Is it about social marketing? What is it that leads people to think, an act such as Peter's described isn't a crime? And I think you're right. It actually then, prompts a lot more questions about, so why is that so? And what does that mean in terms of the way in which services are delivered and the way in which policies are conceived? So I think that's one that I think is a really interesting challenge for us, because I think it's right at the intersection of all of the different parts of the system. Other questions or reflections about what it means for policy and practice? Certainly, I can see a hand over here. Oh, I can see it.
Hi, yep. Kelsey Hegarty from Department of General Practice at University of Melbourne. I'm struck by the 8% who told GPs, and I think it's similar for partner violence. Peter, did that mean they're the largest professional group?
Let me just double check.
Because I think they are with partner violence, and I just wanted to alert people to a program of research led by Laura Tarzia that's going to be looking at unwanted sexual encounters in general practice, but also looking at developing this area further with GPs. And so if anybody's interested, talk to me or Laura, because I think if they are the largest group, it's a group we can work with.
Yeah, they are. So I've got here... of the 718,700 women who told someone about their most recent sexual assault by a male, we've got our 3/4 who first spoke to kind of an informal support. We've then got 1 in 12 spoke to a GP as the first person they disclosed to, and 1 in 15 spoke to police. So those are the kind of first top 3.
Yeah, because we do a lot of work with police, but I think we can really enhance the GP response. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Saray Naidoo from Housing SA in South Australia. We've been doing some work in relation to matching our intervention order database with public housing tenants and trying to deliver or develop some different responses to women and children in those situations. I'm interested to understand whether this survey can further give a subpopulation profile in relation to housing status of women. So are they in private rental, home ownership, public housing or social housing, or within, obviously, the homelessness suite of services?
Not really. It gives you some things that you might be able to give as very rough proxies. So there are two different types of SES measures that are given, one of which is about household income, the other is around the SES status of the area in which someone is located. So that might be able to give you something, but not housing specifically, no.
So talk to me about that question, why you were particularly interested in the nature and types of housing.
Well, we, from a government perspective, obviously we have different responsibilities from the provision of services to women and children in our public housing system, but also from a policy perspective and a funding perspective. I think we've been trying to improve our service response to women around safety, and what we identified, I think, was we had a 93% match, and that's consistently high with our intervention order database with women living within our public housing system, and that has generated us to develop different types of specialist responses internally, but also focus integrating our service response with community organisations and other government organisations who are more specialised to support women and identify women. From my perspective, it's really important because we want women and children to be as safe as possible wherever they live. And unless we're able to identify women experiencing issues around safety, we're not able to engage with the different stakeholders that we need to, one from an awareness raising perspective, but also from an integration perspective, but also from a policy and funding perspective within a government context. So we're doing that broad exploring work now.
That was as much for my purposes as for the rest of the room, because I think it was a really interesting question to explore about why particularly housing, because we know that overcrowding, we know housing stress obviously contributes to the picture, but I was just interested to further unpack that. Other reflections, questions that people have been thinking about, what does this mean in a policy and practice environment?
You had one.
I can see, yep.
Hi, I'm Liz Little. My only claim to fame is that I'm the immediate ex-chair of NASASSIV, which is the peak of sexual assault. Thank you very much for this paper, Peter. It's been a long time coming. I guess the biggest policy issue is something that I've been hammering now for over a decade, which is while we certainly have a violence against women framework, we need to understand that domestic violence and sexual violence, while they have a lot in common, also have a lot of differences. And I'm delighted to see that ANROWS has started beginning to talk about this whole area. That actually has major impacts given the move across Australia by governments to push sexual assault services in with family violence services without a clearly delineated conceptual framework about what we're doing here, what the practice issues are, who the various different people who are that access services. So I'm delighted to see that ANROWS is beginning to pick that up. But that piece of work about where do these two major issue areas fit under a violence of women framework, what's the policy framework here, still remains to be done. Can I just, from a practice wisdom perspective, come back to the earlier question about women who've experienced sexual violence and their reporting patterns? I think one of my views, and some of my colleagues in this field may also have views, there is a great deal of, I guess, confusion around intimacy. And sexual violence actually falls into the parameter of intimacy, and there's actually cultural norms that women don't actually differentiate whether this is normal sexual activity or not. And I think I've just recently been at a conference around pornography and violence, and I think we're beginning to see changing issues there, particularly for young women. So I think there's an enormous number of policies that are coming forward, and that sexual assault particularly has probably been the understudied area and the silent area, and I'm delighted to see ANROWS picking it up.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one last question. Yep, I can see.
I was just wondering how inclusive the survey was of women from rural and isolated areas.
So the survey does include some sampling from rural, less from remote because of the practical difficulties. There's sufficient validity to be looking at them as a demographic group, but again, you're not seeing statistically significant differences generally there. So it is certainly being able to have those specific statistics, using that modelling to be able to give that broader estimate across Australia is available for rural and remote, but you'll probably need to be using those numbers kind of, I guess, in some ways on their own rather than necessarily discussing them in that context of comparisons, simply because of those limitations.
Thank you, Peter. So, look, as you can see, we could spend a lot of time diving deep, unpacking the data, asking what it means. And I think one of the things we really want to then look at this question about is how do we use this information and knowledge and translate that? And how do we use it in terms of development of policies and practices? So when Heather was trying to introduce me before, and I said to her, don't worry about the title, the issue, and there's a number of Queenslanders here, will reflect upon the fact in Queensland, for example, we've recently received, a very significant report that looks at the question around domestic and family violence, led by a task force that Quentin Bryce chaired. And in fact, our challenge is not to get fixed on the individual recommendations, but actually ask ourselves, what do we need to do in terms of the service systems and the service responses? How do we ensure that the legislation isn't actually the driver, but the facilitator and the supporter? How do we ensure that our practices and our procedures, whether it is ourselves, our justice colleagues, our police colleagues, what does it mean for GPs and midwives? And when we think about some of those questions about, who do women talk to? Who do they report to? It challenges us to start to think about the ways we've always delivered services may not necessarily actually fully respond to some of the issues that women are identifying for us. So the wonderful thing about a presentation such as this is we go away with more questions than answers. And I think what we're going to find is that a number of us are going to keep coming back to this and say, so what does this mean? And what are we going to do differently? And are there things that we need to think about in a different way? So thank you very much, Peter Cox. I've heard Peter now present on a number of occasions, and I have to say, each time, you do it even better than the last. Thank you very much.